Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey,
Good morning.
Today, we are concluding our series on the impossibility of a new home, fiction about immigrants trying to establish a new home. For this series, we read Julie Otsuka's The Buddha in the Attic, Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World, and W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz. If this is your first time listening to us, you can find a link in our episode description to our book club discussion on Reddit at our Canonical Pod. And we are also on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, also in our episode description. Next week, we will begin our new series, Contemporary Nigerian Fiction, with Akwaeke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji. We began this series, The Impossibility of New Home, with a question. Is it possible for immigrants to establish a home in a new country? These three works of fiction imply that creating a new home in a foreign country is, if not impossible, very difficult. Do you think these books satisfactorily answer the question?
I don't know exactly how to answer, only because I think the three of these are dealing with three specific sorts of trauma that are particular to their era and location. For example, Buddha in the Attic is about the Great Depression as it was occurring in California, as well as the World War II internment camps. That only applies to a very specific people at a very specific time and place. And that's true as well with Austerlitz. We're talking about the Holocaust and fleeing from Prague. The only one that I think you can look at more generally is Signs Preceding the End of the World. And even that one, it only shows partly how trying to make a home in a foreign country is difficult in a general sense. But it's also slightly more specific to the problems that we're having here and the opposition to Mexican immigrants, even though it's not specifically about Mexico.
With Signs, something I don't think we talked about in our episode is that it's about illegal immigration. I think there are people who say that doesn't really matter, but to my mind, it matters quite a bit because that is a very different experience from legal immigration.
That's true. We even talked about how the opposite argument happening in Signs, as represented by the police officer, is a really weak argument, and it's not given in good faith. Even though it is part of the argument, it's not the whole thing. So with a weak argument like that, it's not entirely fair to rule out the fact that it is illegal immigration, like you point out.
I think another part of this also is we're kind of rubbing up against the expectations of fiction, which is that it is supposed to be entertaining in some way. And if you have a story about immigrants who are happily settled into their new country, then that's not much of a story. Like, that wouldn't be the gist or the crux of the story. It would be something else, some other conflict or tension in the book. So, because it's supposed to be, work of fiction, it's supposed to be engrossing or appealing in some way, it has to take on a topic that is engrossing or appealing, and it has to have some kind of struggle. In that way, I think fiction is not the best medium to talk about something like this, where there are actually positive experiences, because the medium makes it non-representational.
well, the catch-22 of writing about things in fiction is that we can really only know certain things through fiction because it's the only way that people really focus in on the quiet experiences of other people. But at the same time that we can only really know certain stories through fiction, we can never know the opposite sides of those stories. We can never know the happy, content immigrants, the secure immigrants, because it's unremarkable. I think, though, that said, if we're looking for an answer, I think an answer is not really fair. I don't think any of these writers would want to speak for the entirety of the immigrant condition, but I do think that there is an adversarial aspect to it that exists, and people might not know that it exists. And I think that at least being able to see it, even if we don't see it as the entire experience, is still valuable.
So, if we sort of step back from these books, in your opinion, do you think it is impossible for immigrants to establish a home in a new country?
No, but very difficult. I think even though these are not general experiences, they do show that no matter where it is, no matter where you're coming from or where you're going, it's always difficult to create a new home for yourself. And doing so in a foreign country, in a completely different culture, that just really makes it more difficult.
I think what we can take away from these three books is that even though these books are not very representational of immigration as a whole, the difficulties that these protagonists face, like, for example, systemic racism or the loss of one's homeland, is representative of the immigrant experience. Like, there is something that we can take from these books that we can generalize.
The only thing I would generalize, because I think that it's so disparate that it's really difficult to find a catch all kind of definition, is that the immigrant's definition of home is always going to be larger and more complicated than the non immigrant's definition. And that's pretty much all I can say, because even if it is a positive experience, it's a more complex experience just by virtue of the fact of being in a new place. So, I mean, if we talk about systemic racism, as James did, if you imagine somebody from Canada moving to the US or somebody from Germany moving to the US, I don't know that it really applies. And I understand that's not what you meant. But if we're talking about immigration, using that word, I think we should be as inclusive as possible.
Let's look at immigration from a different angle now. When we think about how it's presented to us historically, we in the US, and all three of us grew up here in the US, often view immigration as something positive or aspirational. You have in your textbooks the land of opportunity, the American dream. However, in these three novels, as we talked about, the experience of immigration is often very negative, and the protagonists' attitudes toward their new homes are ambivalent at best. What accounts for this difference in attitude? Do you think we picked a non representational sample of immigration literature? Or is our positive view toward immigration a product of American propaganda and the educational system? Or do you think perhaps our view toward immigration is changing and that these contemporary works are signifying that kind of change in attitude?
Well, we already discussed how difficult it is to establish a new home, especially in a new place and culture. So I think that will negatively impact these attitudes as well, even if we're mostly looking at it from one side, from the view of the immigrant. But there are positive aspects in that too, or at least in each book, the new place seems like a place of, I was about to say peace, which is sort of true, but it's more stability, I guess. Rigidity in the case of Signs Preceding the End of the World. I guess that's not true in Buddha in the Attic. Buddha in the Attic, it's even more of a bill of sale, and that gets sold to these picture brides. And then it quickly turns worse.
Well, in Austerlitz, it is definitely a haven. And while reading the book, a question I had throughout was I don't know exactly why Austerlitz doesn't like his new home as much as, other immigrants or other children might when they immigrate. Like, I understand that he's missing something, he's missing his family, but his experience doesn't seem so bad compared to the other two books.
Clearly, you've never been to Wales.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think, James, your question, it's kind of talking about things as if they were contradictory, but I don't really see it because, the positive attitude that we have about immigration in the US, it seems naive, but only because people don't acknowledge that it's the macro view, you know? When we zoom far out, it looks good. And from that perspective, it is good. But, when you zoom in on actual lives, it gets more complicated. But I do think, in the broadest perspective, it is generally a good step for a lot of people.
Even Makina in our first book, Signs Preceding the End of the World, she doesn't leave. I know it's a little more complicated than that, but all of these books do deal with not leaving their final home. It has become their new home, negative and positive together. All those characters have eventually made this their home.
I think that we have to acknowledge that it comes with a trade off, right? Like the American way of life is attractive and it makes it seem like immigration is a positive thing, at least just the American context. But I think the trade off that we don't focus on is the quality of life can be different in other ways. Like the American way of life offers people material wealth, but a lot of other kinds of wealth are missing. I think that's part of what Herrera is pointing to with the way he describes America in his novel. But I think if you talk to second generation immigrants, you talk about people who are born in the US to immigrant parents, if you ask them, do you want to leave? Do you want to go back to where your parents are from? They're not going to say yes.
What I'm noticing, and this might be just very specific to my experience, is that I'm noticing the discourse around immigration in the US has changed from when I was much younger to now. Certainly, the political discourse, I think, has changed. The tenor now is much more hostile and shrill. And I think in literature, the prevailing attitude toward immigration, at least viewed from what books are being published, has also changed because 30 years ago, and I also referenced this recently, you had The Joy Luck Club, which is for me the only book on immigration that readily jumps to my mind. It's a book about immigrants, and it is generally a positive book in that, and it's been criticized for this, it doesn't really represent China or Chinese people, the more traditional Chinese people, in a good light. And it's the American way of life that's kind of presented to us in a very happy, positive way. That while there are struggles, the struggles aren't major. And it's a very, I wouldn't say it's a happy ending because it's a collection of short stories, but it's not terrible. They don't encounter trauma. They just kind of deal with mild difficulties along the way. That kind of book on the immigrant experience, the experience of a minority in America, isn't really being written now. When you think back on the minority literature that we are reading now in these last 10 years, it's quite different in tenor.
Well, let me say that I think that this change that you're talking about, James, is probably because of readers like Sam. Only because I think readers like Sam, and I know I'm picking on you here, Sam, but
Go ahead.
you have this sense of justice that you like to see, and you don't want to see, just kind of shiny, happy people living a good life. You want it to be complicated and to have a more adversarial politics. I think that for you, and you can tell me where I've gone wrong, a book like The Joy Luck Club would seem naive.
You're mostly right, with the caveat of what we've already talked about, that fiction with no conflicts, even if the conflicts are different, depending on the book and the focus, there's got to be conflict. And these are very real experiences, even if it does portray a certain light or a certain aspect. I think these are troubles and negativities that people need to see, not just for the people in the new place, but for the people coming to or prospectively coming to the new place.
Yeah, but the kind of conflict is different. And that's, I think, what I'm pointing to here.
Right.
In the Joy Luck Club, the conflict is pretty mild, and even though it does present trauma, the trauma is escaping from Civil War China. So the trauma comes from the country they are leaving, and America is presented as a safe haven. And then you have kind of mild inconveniences of being, mild, I should say, by comparison to what's presented here. Whereas here you have, like a police officer arresting Machina, or you have all the picture brides, being rounded up along with other Japanese. Like, it's very minor by comparison. And it seems to me that there is much more focus on this kind of atrocity, this outrage now. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism about Amy Tan and about how she presents the Asian American experience in the US, especially I think reading it now 20 years later, it does come off as being kind of a whitewashed, like a Chinese Leave It to Beaver almost, where it's just a little bit too happy-go-lucky, I think. But on the other hand, based on what we talked about earlier, that is actually the experience of most Asian immigrants, I think, like mine included, where we are not facing trauma in this new country the way that illegal immigrants are, for example. So, in some ways, a book like that, which is, I think, an inferior book in many ways, is actually more representational. So I'm sort of circling around in my argument here because I don't know. I don't know if our attitudes toward fiction is changing, which is creating a non representational example almost. It's focusing much more on these edge cases of trauma, of inequality, of outrage. And that's probably a good thing. But it's also leaving out these kinds of stories where people happily immigrate.
From my perspective, I think there's room in fiction for both kinds of stories. I think, as much as I tease Sam, I think he's right in the sense that these injustices need to be written about and people need to know about them. But any one thing shouldn't exclude the other. And I think that, quieter conflicts and family dramas and that sort of thing has its place in fiction as well. I just think that when we look at either side and we expect either side to be representative, we're making a mistake. Like when you look at the Joy Luck Club and you say, well, this represents my life. Yeah, it represents your life, but not everybody is like you. So I think it's fair to say that Signs Preceding the End of the World is representational just for a different group of people.
I think early on in the series, we referenced Jhumpa Lahiri, where she's also writing about the immigrant experience, but not about the immigration so much as the problems after the fact. But it's kind of in between what we're talking about with Joy Luck Club and with these novels, especially the ones dealing with the US, where obviously there are still conflicts, but the conflicts are not specific to the moving, to the actual immigration process.
Yeah, I wonder how a book like that would do nowadays if she were being published now, because you have Buddha doing very well in sales, and I think it was a bestseller. I do wonder, that book was published 20 years ago, and yeah, I think tastes are changing. I think the people who are consuming are now more like Sam. It's my feeling is there's this expectation of this kind of woke politics that this is what readers want now.
I mean, as fewer and fewer people read, it's more likely for tastes to move to the edges because there isn't this demand for mainstream fiction or to express mainstream values in fiction because mainstream people don't read fiction anymore.
I guess so, but that was slowing down even 30 years ago. Not to the same extent that it is now, but readership has generally declined over time. I think it's also important to notice that what we're focusing on as a country is different now than it was then. Problems in immigration have always been present, but that's in the center spotlight right now. Those issues are at the forefront a lot more than they were 20 or 30 years ago.
We've been talking a lot about how the traumas in these novels seem to elicit some sort of an emotional response. What I'm more curious about is not that elicitation, but rather the relation that the authors have to that trauma, because it's quite different between these novelists. I think for Herrera, it's a very personal thing because he is a Mexican living and working in the US. He can be very much like Makina. He's very close to her experience. For Otsuka, it's her family history. Her mother and her grandmother were sent to the Topaz internment camp, but that happened 20 years before she was born. And then for Sebald, I think that the Holocaust is a national shame for him as a German, but it's also a personal shame because his father, his absent father, was a German soldier, a Nazi soldier. So, does this distance affect the way that the subject matter is presented in these novels?
I think so. Starting with Herrera, it is a personal experience, but his focus is definitely more on the general sense, maybe partly due to the need for it and the perceived need for it, as we were just talking about, that the market has changed and has gone that direction. With Otsuka, yeah, the focus is definitely on history, even if it's her family history or even if it's people she didn't know personally. That's more concerned with history, as is Austerlitz, except Austerlitz is even more of that national shame. Well, and personal shame too, as you said, growing up the son of a Nazi. But the distance does inform the presentation, definitely. I think it really depends on what they're trying to show the reader.
So I agree with you, but it's kind of, for me, it's like a yes, duh, right? Because obviously the author's point of view toward a subject matter, whether or not he or she experienced it personally or did research in the case of Otsuka, or is looking at it from the outside in the case of Herrera because he's not an illegal immigrant. Like, yes, I mean, it will of course affect how they present their work, but I don't know how to answer the question of how. Like, how has it affected its presentation? Because to me, every work is different. Like, it's different because everyone's relation to the subject matter is different. It's almost as if there are so many data points that I don't think I can answer this question of how does the distance matter? Because, for example, is the distance between Herrera, who is not an illegal immigrant, and Otsuka, whose family personally experienced internment, like, which is more distant? To me, you could say, well, obviously the distance of years creates this kind of distance, so she's looking at it from the outside. But I could easily say, well, Herrera is not an illegal immigrant, so how does he know? Right? Like, I very much doubt that he hired a coyote to actually take him across the border so that he could experience what it was like. So it's an imagined experience that he also has, or something he has to convey by talking to people who have done it. It's the same in some ways. So they're both from the outside looking in. And in Austerlitz, Sebald isn't even Jewish, right? I just think they're so different and disparate. And every writer who writes about this will be approaching it from a different point of view. Like Amy Tan is second generation Chinese American, and she wrote The Joy Luck Club, which is about generation Americans. That's probably as close as you can get. And she also wrote about her parents' generation, the immigrant generation, and then that's removed. So it's hard for me to say, like, to draw any conclusion from this actually, because I think of course they're going to be different, but also I don't think you could say one is closer and one is less close.
You know what my conclusion is? My conclusion is you really love Amy Tan. You cannot stop talking about her.
Yeah, I have a very love-hate relationship with Amy Tan. because she is of the generation, my generation growing up, she is white America's introduction to Asian Americans. Like, if you didn't grow up in New York or the Bay Area and whatever random third place like LA or some other hub of Asian American, Chinese American specifically, population, like that's what white Americans know about Asian Americans. So Amy Tan's very important in that regard. But anyway, yes, back to your comment.
Obviously, what you're saying is true, like, their relationship to the trauma is going to affect the way they present it, and, it's difficult to kind of figure out or measure this relationship, but I guess what I'm trying to get at by asking this kind of question is I'm trying to understand my feelings towards Otsuka specifically because for some reason I have this kind of negative feeling towards her, what you could call ownership of her subject matter. It's clear to me, at least, that when writers approach trauma, specifically immigrant trauma, that there is a sort of ownership and there is a sort of territory. And I could never imagine Sebald writing Signs Preceding the End of the World, but I might be able to imagine Sebald writing a novel where the main character was Jewish. And it's quite distinct, like, why is one territory his and another isn't? And I guess when I'm thinking about Otsuka, it's just the fact that her novel to me, it reads more academic. One thing I had thought when I was reading it is that this is the novel of a kind hearted Asian American studies student with a textbook. Like, it's not lived experience. It feels very, it's like Otsuka is doing some sort of a worship to her ancestors. And that to me, it feels off. And I don't know if it's fair for me to say so, but I don't want to fight my reaction to the novel. So is there anything that we can say about this kind of academic feeling?
Well, part of the reason you're reacting is its success is also one of the reasons we have a problem, that specifically the use of the collective we. That's one of the sources of the issues we had, if not specifically, more generally, because we're not focused on any one story. We're focused on a whole generation. Well, in some ways, we're focused on two generations of trauma, not one person or one family, but a whole group of people. We can say that, we can generalize that with the other two books, but we're still seeing, whether mythologized or given explicitly, we're still seeing the perspective of one character in those two books. It's easier to be damning for Otsuka because I won't say she's trying something more bold, but she's trying something that, while it works, is also the biggest source of pain that we had with the novel.
So I have a question about this actually, because leaving aside the presentation for now, this question of ownership is one that I actually disagree with you yet. Because from my point of view, I think Sebald has the least amount of ownership because he is not Jewish, at least as far as I know. So why does he get to write about the point of view of a Jewish refugee? I think if we set this kind of story in a different setting, if we have the son of a white plantation owner writing a story about the son of a slave, like we would actually, to use Sam's terminology, raise quite a few eyebrows. That's the part I don't get. Like for me, that's obviously the one where he does not have ownership. Whereas Otsuka, at least you can say that she has experienced trauma, secondhand trauma. And with Herrera, I'm not sure. With Herrera, I think you see this where I'm also a little bit wary because he's not an illegal immigrant. Like he's someone who's quite privileged compared to his countrymen. Like, does a privileged person, because he's from the same country, does that give him the right to write about the less privileged from his own culture? In the US, once again, if you take a similar experience, you take like a middle class American writing about what it's like to be homeless, like, you would also say, "Well, hold on, you're not homeless." But the thing is he also gets into race, and it's more about culture and race than it is about, being an illegal immigrant, but I have questions about all 3 actually, but for me, Sebald is the most galling in that, I mean, he's not even Jewish. Like, what why can he write about the Jewish experience? I think when you get into presentation, though, that's where it differs because he doesn't really focus on just the Jewish experience. He focuses on the trauma of the Holocaust as a whole, like its national stain. So when you get into the presentation, that's where it differs. But if you just sort of remove the presentation and look at whether or not an author should write about a topic, like for me, that's actually quite different. I come at this question in an almost entirely opposite way than you, Ed. I actually think that Otsuka probably has the most, quote, "ownership" over this topic, whereas Sebald for me is, I mean, he does it well, so he gets away with it, but someone who's less talented, someone who's less intellectual, I don't think they could write this story. I think they'd be widely and roundly criticized.
I think this is getting adjacent to the discussions that people have about cultural appropriation, and this is probably something that we'll talk about on Reddit, but, I think all 3 of us, even if we disagree, what we would agree is that it's not true that any writer can write about anything. I think we all kind of tacitly understand that there are limitations, but where exactly those limitations and borders are drawn is the concern that I'm trying to get at. I'm not sure if Otsuka is being treated fairly. Like, when I say that I have a problem with her, it's just more of a feeling rather than something that I can really articulate cogently. But I think what distinguishes Sebald is that he doesn't politicize his fiction. It has political import, but he's not really offering a call to arms, or he's not proposing that people think about things in any specific way. And that, I think, gives him more license to talk about lives that aren't his own. With Otsuka, I think that she is trying to speak specifically about the experiences of a group of people that she doesn't actually belong to, except for racially, and she's trying to propose a reaction and a way of thinking about those experiences based on the experiences that aren't actually hers. And that to me is what feels unfair.
Yeah, I think my reaction to this is that it's the presentation that's problematic. It's not really the distance or the ownership. It's how what she is saying is presented. Because I think she could have presented it in a different way, not using the we, for example. And we probably, the readers, the 3 of us anyway, wouldn't have as much of a reaction to it. If she had presented it in an almost sterile way, like the way Sebald does, I don't think we would have an issue with her taking on the subject matter. So for me, I think the issue isn't really the whether or not she is able to talk about the topic, but it's the way she presents it to us. Well, do you think, like, this thing about Herrera writing about legal immigration, like, do you think there's any merit to that? Like, I think, I mean, if there's a Mexican American writing about illegal immigration, I would feel the same way. I'd say, like, well, I mean, it's fine, but you can certainly write about it, but at the same time, it's not your experience. You are writing about a secondhand.
I do want to point out, though, for Herrera, that even though he is sort of more specifically talking about illegal immigration, he's really not. It's more about a transition to a new life in general. Her being illegal is actually pretty minor, other than how she came across and how she gets established. It's not so much about the illegality of the experience as it is the transition into a new place.
I don't agree with you. I think it's not the whole novel, but it is central to the novel. I mean, basically what you're saying is it could be a different novel if it were a different novel.
Well, for me, once again, it goes back to presentation because what the story is kind of also about what the way we interact with the story is it's presented to us in the guise of Mexican mythology, and he is Mexican, so obviously he can present it to us in that way, and so he has ownership over that. That's, I think, why we don't have an issue with how the story reads, is because there always is this veneer of Mexican culture, and he's obviously Mexican. So, I think that's why it's okay. Whereas with Otsuka, the way she forces us to inhabit these Japanese picture brides, you feel like, well, she has to be a Japanese picture bride to give us this story, but she's not. So then you feel like, well, it's kind of a lie. I don't know. I mean, I think it really goes to the presentation. That's what's kind of off putting. All right, let's take a short pause. When we come back, we'll talk about the author's decision to write in their chosen language. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In Signs Preceding the End of the World and Austerlitz, they are both about a new place, but were originally written in the language of another place, their home countries. On the other hand, The Buddha in the Attic was written in the language of the new place. Does this difference mean anything to you?
I think audience really matters here. Buddha in the Attic is much more interested in reaching the people in the new place, not that people in Japan should be excluded from the audience. I just think it matters to them less. The experience will matter to them less. That's true in Signs as well, Signs Preceding the End of the World. But I think the book is equally as interested in the previous place and people from or in the previous place. Buddha in the Attic's previous place, Japan, is also part of the complexity, but it's a bit different. It's not as interested in returning to that place. That's barely even a question in that book.
I think that's actually very interesting because, to my mind, Buddha is very much an American book. Even though it's about being excluded from America, it's in dialogue with American politics and contemporary American culture. As we mentioned, the left conversation that's happening, the progressive conversation that's happening. I think if he had published this book in Japanese, and maybe it was published in Japanese, I don't know if it would have much readership. We actually had a series on Japanese contemporary literature, and it's really different from what's going on in this book. Now, that wasn't a representational sample, of course, but you just look at, what this book is trying to do, and I don't think Japanese writers are trying to do this. I don't think, for example, that they're trying to create some kind of woke politics in their work. So I actually think like this book is very American.
Yeah, I would agree.
Like I think the audience is American because she's American and the topic is American. It's actually not a Japanese topic at all.
In terms of audience, though, I just wonder at what point in the process of writing did the novelist consider that these works would be translated? Because there is a sense that in, Signs Preceding the End of the World, that Herrera is talking about America when America isn't listening. And that gives him a certain freedom or a certain way of thinking about his subject matter that he wouldn't have if he were writing in English. he may have intended from the beginning that this novel would be so successful that, of course, it would be translated into English. But if it was written for, a Mexican Spanish speaking audience, that must impact the way that he's thinking about America. And I think that it probably makes America less sympathetic than it would have been otherwise. But, perhaps not to a great degree, because I don't think that he needs to be wary of American readers because, like I said earlier, American readers like Sam have a taste for blood.
The real standout for me though here is Austerlitz. That's not written in the language of either of the places. It's written in a third language.
Yeah.
That was written in German. That's very different from the question of the other two here. So what does that bring to the table? What does that difference mean?
I think that Austerlitz doesn't fit as specifically into the series if we think of it specifically as immigration as the other two do, but I think it's much more about being out of place. And then it does fit. And I think because it's not specifically about immigration, the novel doesn't need to be written in Czech or Welsh or English because it's not about, the Czech Republic or Wales or England. I think it's a novel about Europe, and any European language would work.
All right, let's conclude now. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next week when we move on to our new series, Contemporary Nigerian Fiction, with Akwaeke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji. You can find our updated reading schedule on Reddit at our Canonical Pod, where we also post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. And on Reddit, you can also chat with us about the topics we just discussed. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you liked this podcast, please go ahead and give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That helps other people find us and helps build our community. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.